Hello, I'm Chris Lopdol, Stanisiopoulos. This microphone is right here. This is Man Free World. Tech Support is coming out Tuesday. Close up that portal. Today we're talking about uh, it's the subject of the moon landings, and this is a new one to me. I thought I knew a lot about the moon landing fakery, but this fake rocket stuff, yeah, we might have a little problem with the timing of when things were actually available in technology wise. So yeah, of course this is coming from a Russian. I'm gonna listen to it at I was listening to it at 1.75x. So I've sped this up a little bit just to get through it. But yeah, looks like we might have some more fakery to expose. This is so fun. I love this. People, the NASA fanboys really cannot stand any of this stuff. It's like I love it because I do want to get to space, and I do think that we've been gypped because of this fakery to win a war, Cold War, which I understand. Why they did it, I get it. But it's time to like actually go to to space again. Let's actually do it now. So yeah, so this gets into it. Let's go.
Hello, dear viewers of the Day TV channel. A brief introduction. Do you remember the event when Vladimir Putin was shown a photo of the American landing on the moon, processed by artificial intelligence? And in those areas where the artificial intelligence had doubts about the authenticity of it being really taken on our natural satellite, it painted those areas red. And as a result, it turned out that practically the entire photograph was painted red. That is, it had doubts that it was taken specifically on the moon, while it had no doubts about the photos taken by Soviet or Chinese lunar rovers. So, we are once again discussing American missions to the moon with the cameraman Leonid Konovalov. Our previous
Now I would like to say that it was AI detector. It's also run through an AI. So, you know, which AI can we check to see which one you're using? You say you're using the Googles, but we haven't actually seen the public demonstration of that. So, whatever. I mean, there's other ways to detect other than using an AI that these missions. There's some evidence missing.
Meeting, when we discussed the Apollo 17 mission, sparked great interest. There were many comments, and we immediately agreed that this would not be our only meeting. Moreover, Leonid Konovalov can talk a lot about this topic because he wrote this book. When will the USA admit that they never went to the moon? In this book, he processed and examined all available videos and photos that NASA presents as evidence of the American astronauts having traveled to the moon and back, and he proves that all of them were taken here on Earth.
Yeah, so this is a video coming from this got moon fakery. He's got 5K subs. Imitation of the Apollo 11 launch by Konovalov. And yeah, go give him a like and subscribe. Fair use, by the way. We're doing a watch along.
That is, Americans did not go to the moon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Last time we discussed Apollo 17, and now let's go back to the origins. Apollo 11?
Indeed, it makes sense to talk specifically about Apollo 11, and not so much about the lunar mission, but simply about the launch itself. Because there is a lot of interesting material gathered, and I would like to share it. Some of the information, of course, can be found in my book about how the alleged lunar surface footage was taken. But today I would like to talk about the earthly part of the missions and specifically about the lunar rocket. The thing is, even now, in our time, landing softly on the moon is a very challenging task. For example, here
Yeah, it's 2023, 2020, all the missions they've been crash. But they nailed it the first time.
is an account of the last 5 to 6 years. In 2019, the Israeli lunar lander, Bereshit, crashed. Then, in 2019, there was Chandrayaan-2. In 2018, the Chinese microsatellite for radio astronomy, Longjiang-1, fell from orbit. In 2022, the Japanese lander, Omotenashi, also crashed. Among other things, there was also the American lunar satellite, IceCube. The Japanese had high hopes for their lunar lander, Hakuto-R, but it also crashed.
So there's something about the Russian culture. They go into a little bit more detail than American culture. So Americans usually do 3. Russians seem to do 6. If they give you 6 examples before it's like, okay, do you see the pattern? All right, that's just a little bit of cultural difference.
An American rocket was also supposed to carry the UAE rover to the moon. The United Arab Emirates prepared their small rover named Rashid. I want to show it. The UAE rover also crashed. There was also a small Japanese rover called Sora Q. Everything crashed. Quite recently, in August 2023, Luna 25 failed to land softly and crashed. Just recently, literally in January of this year, the American spacecraft Peregrine didn't even reach orbit. It arrived, but there was no moon in the place where it was planned. It returned and burned up in the atmosphere. And very recently, on February 23rd, the American spacecraft Odysseus was supposed to make soft landing, but its landing speed was 3 times higher than planned, causing it to tip over. By all calculations, the landing was hard, so it likely crashed. So, even soft landing on the moon moon is very challenging. This raises questions. How did people land 6 times more than half a century ago? Nowadays, it's difficult to land even a small rover, a tiny one. The Japanese planned the Sora Q rover to be the size of a shoebox. Even a lightweight rover cannot be delivered and softly landed. How did they land giant rockets and lunar modules weighing 15 tons on the moon? The answer is simple. Nobody in America planned to go to the moon in 1969. Moreover, a few years before that, at least in 1965, a decision was made for an alternative mission, meaning a mission without leaving a film studio.
Yeah. Okay. So there was a couple. It's like they had a couple missions going on. One was this film studio version. One was a live launch that may not be live and may be pre-recorded and made some parts were live and recorded by people who didn't really know what they're seeing. And okay, yeah. So they're using a mix of things here, real stuff, fake stuff, in a blended way. And the reason why he goes into a lot of detail, which I'll allow him to spool out a little bit more here, is because this is kind of shocking to hear. If you've never gone down some of these rabbit holes. Now, this isn't actually as shocking to me because I kind of feel like I've seen the launch curves. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't really look right. But this is the first I've heard someone put the data together. Of course, it's got to be Russian, right? So, I also take those with a grain of salt. It is also maybe a psyop as well. So we've got competing psyops that we're dealing with. So I'm aware of that. And I think it's pretty fun, actually.
Besides, until recently, I thought, well, they couldn't land softly on the moon. There were many dangers. They needed to somehow beat the Soviet Union in the space race, but surely they at least reached low Earth orbit or made it to the moon. But when I started investigating these problems and watched videos of the Saturn V rocket launch, which allegedly carried all the Apollo missions to the moon, it turned out that it was a mock-up rocket. In reality, only the first stage worked, while the second and third stages were empty shells. That's what I wanted to talk about now. There's a wonderful documentary film called The Engines That Came In From the Cold, released in 2001. By association, someone might know.
The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. I remember such a movie.
Yes, there was a novel by John le Carré in the 1960s, which was later adapted into a movie. Do you know what this phrase, cold, means? It means finding yourself in a place previously inaccessible to you, in some unfamiliar circumstances. And this documentary tells the story of how U.S. intelligence learned that in our hangars we had engines that we built in the 1970s for moon rockets. Then, in 1974, they were ordered to be destroyed, but they were hidden, and in the 1990s, when our country was in dire straits, it was decided to enter the international market and sell the engines.
Okay, I need to fix something. Hold on. All right, sorry about that. Let me back up.
For moon rockets. Then, in 1974, they were ordered to be destroyed, but they were hidden, and in the 1990s, when our country was in dire straits, it was decided to enter the international market and sell the engines. When the Americans saw them and acquired them, they were simply thrilled. The documentary, The Engines That Came In From the Cold, tells the story of how the Americans were amazed. Firstly, they were amazed by the design of the engine. I'll show a still from this film. The essence is this. We have kerosene fuel and liquid oxygen. They are pumped separately at very high pressures into the combustion chamber, where they are ignited, and a stream of hot gases propels the rocket. There's a gas turbine depicted here in the middle, which creates necessary pressure. But for pressure to appear, pre-burner must be fed with fuel, and it also uses kerosene and liquid oxygen. The exhaust products from the pre-burner are dumped over a side into the atmosphere. But our engineers decided to do the following. This is called generator gas staged combustion, to channel the exhaust products from the pre-burner back into the combustion chamber. And as a result, the lifting power of the rocket is boosted by almost 25%. When the Americans saw this design, they said, my God, either everything should melt, or there must be an explosion. But there wasn't. These engines were developed by Nikolai Kuznetsov. In 1972, engines NK-33 and NK-43 were specifically made for our moon rocket. This is called the staged combustion cycle. In engine construction, Americans lagged behind us, probably by 20 to 30 years, at least in staged combustion engines. They developed the Raptor 2 only in 2023, so they were 50 years behind. And speaking of engines, the most interesting thing, as you understand, without an engine, the rocket won't fly anywhere. Here's their American rocket. At the top is the Apollo spacecraft. And this is the Saturn V carrier rocket. Everywhere it's said to be the most powerful rocket. It had 5 F1 engines on the first stage, which produced incredible thrust, 690 tons force each engine. Let's look at our domestic engines. On the left is Kuznetsov's development, the NK-33. Currently, the most powerful is the modern single-chamber engine RD-191. It's on the right, which is used on our Angara rocket. Its thrust is 196 to 197 tons force at sea level. So, we're approaching about 200 tons per chamber. We have other engines. Here, for example, we see the RD-180. It has 2 combustion chambers and a thrust of 390. But if we divide by 2 combustion chambers, we again get 195, about 200 tons. There's the RD-171 engine. It has 4 combustion chambers and a thrust of 790. That is, if we divide about 800 by 4, we again get about 200 tons force. We have now reached the threshold of such thrust, while in the 1960s, the most powerful American engine was 90 tons force. If we look at the official history of the development of kerosene engines, as it is published everywhere, it turns out that the modern Falcon...
Okay, so what they're showing here is this development of the thrust, how the capabilities were over time, how much they were increasing. And all of a sudden, right in 1969, we pop up here and got the F1 engine, which is putting out the 200 pounds of thrust. I mean, that 690 pounds, which is they're hitting 200, like they're maxing out 200, and they're saying the F1 engine by itself, this big, huge thing, big chamber, very American style. All of a sudden, boom, 690 pounds of thrust, and then we lost the technology, and it took till the Soviet Union breaking up. That we got information from the Russians about how to do this, and we just adopted their engines. So something doesn't. Why are we like lagging behind here? And all of a sudden, in 1969, all of a sudden, boom. Okay, all right, keep going.
Falcon 9 rocket has Merlin engines, which have a thrust of 67 tons. Therefore, to lift the rocket, they attach 9 engines. Our engines have approached 200 tons force, and we have long been at this level. But the breakthrough for the Americans happened somewhere from the moment when the Apollo appeared, from 1967 to 1973 when Skylab was there. Suddenly, they had an incredible fantastic engine F1 with a thrust of 690. This graph, proposed by Vladimir Vishkardin from St. Petersburg, shows the thrust per chamber.
Okay, so and this is a different slide. So the guy that they made this thing, they translated the slide for us. Thank you. And you can see there was a fight going back and forth since the 30s between the Soviets and Americans, Germans, of course. Yeah, so that's what's going on.
Curve. The very existence of F1 stands out from the entire history of design of kerosene rocket engines. It could not have been created. In fact, this engine in terms of thrust was probably 8 times weaker.
I like how the Russians are super subtle about it. It just couldn't be created. It's like, it's like, okay, you can't create it. They didn't have jumping technology and then lose it all of a sudden, and we're amazed to find it again. Come on. Okay.
The thing is, the lunar rocket is very heavy. So I'd like to first explain why it's heavy. Inside the rocket itself, at the top, there's the Apollo spacecraft. And here are 3 stages that must put all of this into lunar orbit. Actually, inside the Apollo, there are several components. What do I mean? There are different stages. Here, for example, is the first stage, second stage, third stage. Then separately, there's the lunar module. So, 3 spacecraft are placed in lunar orbit at once. The lunar module has its own engine. When it lands, the lower stage is discarded, remains on the moon, and the upper part lifts off. So, these are 2 independent spacecraft, and also the Apollo spacecraft orbits the moon, which is here at the top, also with its own engine. Thus, inside this 3-stage rocket, at the top, there are 3 spacecraft more. Because of this, the weight of the lunar rocket is about 3,000 tons. Americans say 3,000 tons, and we have 5 engines. We divide 3,000 by 5, and it's 600 tons. So, just to keep the rocket hanging on thrust, each engine must lift 600 tons. And for the rocket to take off, it needs 690. In the Soviet Union, we took a different approach. We developed a lunar rocket of roughly the same height, maybe slightly lighter. 2,500, 2,600 tons, roughly the same in height, but what was the main difference? We had 30 engines, 6 in the center and 24 around the circle.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I always wondered, like, okay, wouldn't it be easier to have, I mean, it's hard to control the thrust, but if you had some sort of mechanism to control that better, yeah, wouldn't it be better to have a whole bunch of little engines than one big fat, 5 big fat ones? I always thought this was a much clever plan, and more intuitive for me because of playing with rockets quite a bit as a kid, all kinds of different rockets, water, gas, all kinds. And I was like, this seems to make more sense. Easier to ship, easier to build, disposable, smaller. Anyway.
So, in our country, it was understood that we couldn't make a super powerful engine. Consequently, we made 30 engines around the circle. Americans have now taken exactly the same path. For example, their super heavy rocket has 27 engines. So, the path of designing a brilliant, super powerful engine turned out to be a dead end. And after many years, Americans repeated what we had already achieved back in the 70s. In the film, The Engines That Came In From the Cold, it's recounted that when engineers saw how it was all designed, they were amazed and said, "How can this be? This is incredible."
I mean, that's conjecture, right? We haven't actually some documentation of that. But that being said, we didn't have the tech. We all of a sudden we had it, and then we didn't have it anymore. We had to get it from the Russians. Okay, we did a different technology path. They showed us like you can't do these big engines. They're not going to work right. You're not going to get the thrust you want. You have to do a bunch of little ones.
I'll now read a few lines from this film. When the space race began, everything related to rocketry, engines was a top secret. At our Institute of Cinematography, GI, for many years, Boris Smirnov was the head of the Department of Cinematography. When he was a very young man, he worked in the photo lab and taught all our cosmonauts, including Yuri Gagarin, how to work with different cameras. He said that everything was so clandestine that we didn't call any of them cosmonauts. We just called them students. And imagine, the USA lagged behind us by 20 to 30 years, and then after Perestroika, we suddenly revealed all the space secrets. So, it was a huge betrayal. And the film, The Engines That Came In From the Cold, is quite rare in that sense, that it really talks about the priority of the Soviet Union in the field of rocket engines. Because all other American films are propaganda work. They say,
I mean, this is propaganda as well, so let's be real honest.
"Look, we're super duper. All countries lag behind us." But in reality, that's not true, and we were far ahead in engine development.
They brought in Werner von Braun precisely because they couldn't do it themselves. They had to.
The Americans were stuck. Yeah, they did. We brought in Project Paperclip.
Not true, and we were far.
Brought in the Germans who looked like we got to pick the litter, right? Because we kind of won World War II for everybody. So we got to pick our litter, and we picked Werner, and then he did the rocket programs for us. So.
Far ahead in engine development.
They brought in Werner von Braun precisely because they couldn't do it themselves. They had to call in a former comrade who bombed London with his V2s.
Yeah.
To get the job done. So, it turns out.
It's true, though. Really? Is this how we do it? Okay.
That von Braun was also a puppet?
Yes. Now, I'll read a few quotes. "The power of these engines exceeds American counterparts by 10 to 15%. We are not accustomed to such technologies. It was a revolution in our scientific worldview. This technology was so unique that Western scientists considered it impossible. The NK-33 design used technologies that Americans were not familiar with. And we sold them our secrets. But what actually took them to the moon? It is Nikolai Kuznetsov, whom we talked about, the chief designer of aviation engines."
Doesn't he look like a designer of aviation engines? He does, man. This guy looks like a designer of aviation. It's like eyebrows. Like, I will make it fly fast. I will make it fly straight. I will make it fly strong.
He was primarily a designer of aviation engines and then rocket engines. In the documentary, The Engines That Came In From the Cold, everyone admires our engines, and then an American specialist says, "The Russians put 30 engines on the rocket, and we only had 5. So, our engines are 6 times stronger. But where are your engines now, that are 6 times more powerful? There was a period from the beginning of the Saturn development in 1967 to 1973. So where are they now? They're in museums. Why don't you use them? They're way too powerful. Nobody needs such engines."
Yeah, they're way too powerful. You don't want those engines. Yeah, they're way too powerful. That's totally American response.
They say that the Saturn drawings have not been preserved. They cannot reproduce these engines.
They did say that. But that's true. They're on record saying this technology is too advanced for modern men. There were better guys back then, and they had the willpower to do.
I looked. The drawings of these engines were posted. They exist. On many drawings, instead of F1, it says H1. So, this is an engine that was on a completely different launch vehicle, not the Saturn V. I think the thrust was only 90 tons force, so the actual thrust was significantly less.
If they had an engine of 600 tons, then one engine would launch the spacecraft into orbit.
They could immediately deliver a giant structure to the ISS, rather than how we currently do it with small blocks and adapters.
Yeah, just throw it up there like we do with the Saturn. Wouldn't that be more efficient? No? Never heard of it? Okay.
How is all of this really put together? This is the rocket that supposedly went to the moon. It turns out that only the first stage actually worked, and instead of the second stage, there was a spool. The diameter of this stage is 10 meters.
Yeah,
There's a feature.
I don't understand this spool thing. It's just a spool. And I'm not really sure what that is, but that is a NASA thing. That's real. That's not AI. But they just put this cone thing in there for like a filler.
The diameter of this
I've never seen these.
actually worked, and instead of the second stage, there was a spool.
This right here. I've never
The
seen.
diameter of this stage is 10 meters.
I think spool might be a mistranslation.
There's a feature film called Countdown, 1968.
Oh wait, look at that. I got the spool here too. There's.
It's a fictional film with actors. All the action takes place on Earth and on the moon. The spacecraft wasn't ready, and the American mission went to beat the Soviet one to the moon. For the ambiance, to create environment, there are shots of a real launching area and real rockets. And this spool is being transported on a platform. In reality, this is nothing but the second stage of the Saturn launch vehicle. It has a gigantic diameter of 10.2 meters. So, the second stage was actually an empty shell on the outside. Therefore, in reality, the lunar rocket weighed not as much as the Americans claimed, but much less. The third stage was also empty. This shows its assembly and installation.
Interesting. Isn't that fascinating? If somebody showed me this picture, I would have not known what this thing is and why it's there. Be like, okay, that's a weird picture, but okay.
Of these dummy stages.
Are these photos from the movie?
No, this is already a real assembly. They asked, where did these photos come from? Why put a dummy? They just hadn't brought the real second stage yet, so they decided to experiment with a dummy. Therefore, it's a full-scale dummy, not real. In reality, the rocket was light, but even in this case, it couldn't climb high. I believe that this lunar rocket only managed to rise, believe it or not, 17 kilometers up.
This part is tripping.
Before, I thought, well, okay, they didn't land on the moon, but at least they reached low Earth orbit and filmed some footage in orbit.
Yeah, I assume they just did all this moon fakery just from low Earth orbit, but they may not even gotten there.
It turns out that's not the case. I analyzed films, video clips, amateur videos, and found a very strange thing.
Surely everyone interested in the moon missions knows about Phil Polish's amateur video.
The thing is, on the day of the Apollo 11 launch, there was light cloud cover, cirrus clouds at about 6.5 kilometers high, maybe up to 8. When the rocket took off, it pierced through these clouds, with the sun above, casting its shadow on the cloud. Here's that shadow. Since the height of the clouds is approximately known, it turned out that the time it took for the rocket to reach these clouds was significantly longer, 106 seconds. So, the rocket had just reached these clouds, and theoretically, to reach low Earth orbit, by the 106th second, this rocket should already be at an altitude of 25 kilometers.
I know the size of the rocket, the size of the shadow. I calculated it, and it turns out that the height of the clouds is 6,500 meters.
This is a completely normal height for cirrus clouds. It turns out that the rocket does not follow the theoretical black line on the graph, where everything is outlined in seconds. We know that after 600 seconds, the rocket...
Okay, yeah, so it's supposed to follow this curve, but it follows this one down here. It's not gonna make it. All right, let's keep going.
Should already be in low Earth orbit, and then it flies by inertia. It turns out that besides these clouds, through which the rocket flies, there is another point that allows us to determine very accurately the distance the rocket has traveled. At a certain altitude is the so-called tropopause, where the temperature changes not as we are used to. Usually, as we ascend higher and higher, the temperature drops lower and lower. But after 8 kilometers,
I just want to say out loud, like, what is going on with this guy's shirt? There's a really fancy shirt you got there, buddy. Okay, it's on TV, all right.
in polar regions, it's 8 to 10 kilometers. In mid-latitudes, it's about 12 to 14 kilometers. There's a section where the temperature goes in the opposite direction. It starts rising. This is a thin layer about 2 to 3 kilometers thick.
When the ascending rocket enters the tropopause,
A contrail forms behind it.
I'll show you a picture.
About 3 days ago, there was a SpaceX launch. When the rocket flies, on the top right picture, we see the trail of burning gases, and then at a certain distance, a trail like this appears.
Just like behind airplanes.
Yes. It appears for just a few seconds.
I've prepared 2 clips. One of a Russian Soyuz rocket launched from the Vostochny Cosmodrome. Let's watch a snippet of the video.
Here, the video indicates the altitude in the right corner, 9 kilometers. This is at 40 seconds. At 50 seconds, the altitude is 13 kilometers. Then, at around 14 kilometers altitude, the vapor trail begins to appear. And when the rocket reaches 18 kilometers, the vapor trail disappears. So, it appears from around 55 seconds to 60 seconds.
Let's watch the clip. I chose a night launch. The vapor trail is condensation of moisture on particles of soot and such.
Some say, let's call it a condensation trail. Whatever it's called, it looks very interesting.
I've selected footage for our rocket and for the American one.
Now, the announcer is saying the altitude is 11 kilometers. 12 kilometers. He's counting the seconds. About 50 seconds have passed. And a beautiful spectacle begins. 17 kilometers, 18 kilometers. The trail disappears. So, around the 55 to 60 second mark, the contrail appears. This is the launch of an American rocket. The timing is a bit later here. In the top right corner, there's the altitude. The rocket is at 8 kilometers altitude, approaching 9 kilometers, and we see a beautiful night-lit scene. The contrail appears. It passes 11 kilometers, 12. The rocket exits the tropopause, and the condensation trail disappears. I also show the launch of Starlink. The rocket is flying. At the bottom, we see 12 kilometers, 13, 14, 15 kilometers. After 17, the contrail begins to fade and vanishes. So, when the contrail forms behind the rocket, you can tell at what altitude the rocket is flying. I did a frame-by-frame analysis of the Apollo 11 launch and traced the entire trajectory. Here, with an arrow, I marked the moment when the rocket crosses the light cloud cover, casting a shadow. Then, after 30 seconds, it flies upwards, the contrail appears, and then the most interesting part. We just watched the video. The contrail is always straight. So, the rocket flies straight, maybe with a slight tilt. But during the Apollo launch, there was an interesting. This contrail curved in an arc, descended.
It started to fall.
Yes, I see
Alright, sorry about that. A little technical difficulties.
the entire trajectory. Here, with an arrow, I marked the moment when the rocket crosses the light cloud cover, casting a shadow. Then, after 30 seconds, it flies upwards, the contrail appears, and then the most interesting part. We just watched the video. The contrail is always straight. So, the rocket flies straight, maybe with a slight tilt. But during the Apollo 11 launch, there was an interesting sight. This contrail curved in an arc, and the rocket descended in a parabola. So, after passing through the clouds,
It started to fall.
yes, I see it started to fall. At that moment, it was at an altitude of approximately 17 kilometers. With Apollo 11, this occurred at the 140th second. Theoretically, the rocket should have been at an altitude of 47 kilometers, but at this moment it passes through the tropopause, meaning its altitude is approximately, as written in blue, 14 kilometers. Instead of ascending along the black line, the rocket is actually following this trajectory. Here is where the first stage stops working. The first stage has used up all its fuel. The rocket won't fly any further. Its only path is to fall into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I want to show you how it should have been. The rocket takes off. If we stand and watch, at first it seems
Right. So, given that trajectory, it fell into the ocean. That's what I kind of always thought was looked a little strange. They say, no, it's going over the horizon. It's like, I don't know, man. It looks like it's going right into the ocean, man. It's like, no, it's going further. You're just seeing it. No, it's like he was saying, like, if it actually is going up, you'll just kind of hang there. And it's not going to go down. It's going to hang. Okay.
that the rocket is ascending strictly upwards. Then, we follow it in the second and third points. The rocket dips slightly downwards. And then, when the first stage separates, the rocket should be at an altitude of 66 kilometers and 95 kilometers downrange. We should see the rocket ascending, dipping slightly down, and then standing still for a long time. But what do we see in reality? The rocket goes up and flies down in a parabola. We found 3 amateur videos where the rocket ascends and is seen descending in a parabola. In addition to amateur videos, just recently, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, many Apollo 11 launch videos were uploaded on YouTube. I sped them up, so you could see how it all happens. Here's the launch. You see there's light cloud cover in the sky. That's why there's no bright blue sky. The rocket is flying. Light cloud cover. The middle layer is 20% cloud cover, and above, there are cirrus clouds, 90%. It approaches the layer of cirrus clouds, a shadow passes, and then in reality, 30 seconds pass, it's slightly sped up here. A contrail forms, and the rocket descends. It's flying downwards. Now, pay attention to the most important part. It will go through these clouds again, and we lose sight of it. It's not visible. So, at this moment, the first stage should have separated. Everyone says, how is that possible? Didn't the spectators see the rocket falling? To that, I can say the following. Firstly, the spectators saw this for the first time in their lives. They didn't know what it was. They thought, well, the first stage is falling, and the second one is continuing. We have watched hundreds of launches and already know how it all happens, how it should have looked, but people saw it for the first time, so nobody suspected anything. But the main point is this. I'll show you a few pictures now. This is Apollo 16 also taking off, turning, and flying here.
They broadcast this live, worldwide, and showed it all. No questions asked?
I would say that the Americans do it carelessly, whether it's live broadcasting or documentaries. What does that mean? In 2019, for the 50th anniversary of the supposed moon landing, an Apollo 11 documentary was released. It was simply called Apollo 11. They show footage of Apollo 11's launch. I can even show it to you. What's the gist of the matter? Instead of Apollo 11, the Americans show a completely different rocket. Bright blue sky, low sun. Here's a steelwork and its shadow. Here's the corner of this steelwork and its shadow, meaning the sun is very low. But according to the film, this is 7 seconds before the launch. Everything is already rumbling and roaring, and in 7 seconds, the rocket should already be lifting off. But this is an Apollo 8 footage, which launched early in the morning, when the sky was completely clear. That's why they substituted Apollo 8 for Apollo 11. And you're talking about live coverage. When they showed the launch, they always cut to short clips, from this camera, from another camera. There are cine theodolites, which are theodolites combined with movie cameras. It's a little telescope. It not only tracks but also records angles, and so on. If you go on YouTube right now and try to find the launch of Apollo 11, filmed in one long continuous shot, you'll see that almost all Apollo 11 launches are of a different rocket. There's no moment when the rocket passes through the clouds. I took one cine theodolite recording. The rocket is flying, but where did it pass through the clouds and cast a shadow? If that was a moment when it was near the cloud, but it passed right through it, so regardless of which camera they shot from any distance, that moment physically exists. In almost all videos titled Apollo 11 launch, uploaded on YouTube, there's no moment of passing through the clouds. And when they showed the live broadcast, it was clear that the rocket was barely lifting. There's a film about moon rockets. Even the commentators say that the rocket was lifting so slowly that we were afraid it would fall right then, and we wanted to give
I always thought that too. It's like, dang, that thing's lifting pretty slow. Like, you think it'd be just like kind of rocketing out. Like the V2 is like, it gets out of there. Every rocket I've ever had, zing, it's out of there. Even when I would try and intentionally weight it down, I'm kind of stupid that way. I was like, what kind of thing do? Still, it's or it just sits there. It's either whoosh, or it just sits there.
it a push. But what happened during the live broadcast? They showed the rocket, and then in some blurry haze, they showed a pre-recorded flight of another rocket. So, regardless of how the rocket's flight ended, there was already a continuation, filmed by another camera. They switched to another camera and showed the flight of that rocket. It's all murky.
So, they mixed several launches, didn't they?
Yes, and even in the documentary, instead of Apollo 11, they show 4 completely different rockets. For example, the separation of the interstage ring, which connects the stages, was filmed even before Apollo 11. It's from Apollo 4 or Apollo 6, so these are completely different rockets.
They just made a mix. It's like in the joke about the Chukchi people who all look alike.
So, they say, well, all the Apollos look alike, makes no difference.
They could have taken precautions. They were broadcasting live, and maybe the camera on Apollo 11 broke down. So, they took footage from Apollo 4 as a backup.
So many years had passed, they could have found some footage. When Yuri Gagarin went into
Come on. It's not that hard. People were super into all this stuff, so come on.
space, there was a television camera named Siliger next to him in the descent capsule. It wasn't just one camera, there were 2.
One filmed him from the front, and the other slightly from the side.
Moreover, when in the Soviet Union we sent dogs into space, we also had a television camera, although the resolution was very low. Approximately 100 lines horizontally and vertically, low resolution, but we needed to see how they felt in space. So, here's the most interesting part. Americans boast that they have super compact cameras, that they had hundreds of cameras set up during the launch. About 3,000 operators came to film the Apollo 11 launch, and not a single camera was placed inside. So, if we watch the launch of Apollo 11, and there are still about 40 minutes left before takeoff, what do they show us during these 40 minutes? They show us anything and everything. The only thing they don't show is the astronauts.
The astronauts' faces.
Yes. So, look, they show the top. Here's the launch escape system on top, the engine nozzle below, mission control center, the rocket from a distance, spectators walking around, VIPs, somebody from the government. They show it again. 8 different cameras, and not a single camera that showed the faces.
Which would show Armstrong saying, "Off we go."
Yes, how they take off, the G-forces.
But the thing is, there was nobody in that rocket at all. I mean, we recorded video.
Well, not the entire mission, but the camera turned on several times, made certain recordings, and we have that for history. And what did they show? They showed nothing. They showed an empty rocket for 40 minutes straight. Nowadays, when our Soyuz is launched, there's a little toy hanging there. During liftoff, it's on an elastic band, and you can immediately tell when zero gravity sets in.
I mean, we can't even imagine not showing the crew during liftoff.
They showed nothing because there was nobody there.
Next was the Apollo 12 mission.
It was cloudy, with light rain, low clouds, and the rocket disappeared behind the clouds literally within seconds. So, they decided to show the astronauts inside the spacecraft. Let me show you how it looked. It's a watercolor drawing. They showed watercolor drawings.
I'm not sure whether they were from comics or magazine illustrations.
That's how they showed it. They had nothing. They showed the launch of an empty rocket.
It was from the same arts and crafts class that they built the lander out of. The same class, they had a little painting class. Like, you guys can paint little portraits over here, make them look happy.
Live. The thing is, it was shot like all movies are shot. Take any famous movie, for example, with Tom Cruise. We read that a film is in production. And when is the premiere? Just 2 years later. It was the same here.
The premiere of the Apollo 11 launch was scheduled for July 16, 1969. But the actual shooting took place 2 or 3 years before that.
So, it was like a premiere of a new film.
We show our film.
Today, it's a grand presentation with fireworks. The Apollo 11 launch was just fireworks.
The rocket didn't go higher than 17 kilometers.
The engines were very weak. The second and third stages were empty shells. So, you could say it was essentially a dummy.
Let me ask you, what do you think about how they filmed it? Everyone talks about Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, as the prototype for that filming. Is that true? No?
I would even say more. It was a cover-up operation. That is, Kubrick was...
Yeah, multiple. There's had to be multiple things going on. You're not just going to win World War II and then lose the Cold War. No, we're not doing that.
Tasked with developing various methods to simulate lunar gravity, 0G.
So, he did all of that.
Do you know what the biggest problem for Kubrick was? There's a technique called rear projection. Now it is replaced with chroma key. There's a movie screen behind the actor, and the image is projected onto it. But in those years, the film sensitivity was low, 160 units. So, if you make the screen big, like in a large theater, for example, 27 meters like at October, the screen brightness will be very weak. If I place the actor in front of the screen and light him up as in broad daylight, then nothing will be visible on the screen behind. The image will be very weak. And so, Kubrick was developing technology to make a giant 30-meter screen, and so that the image on it would be very bright. He tried out all sorts of options. To shoot such weak brightness, NASA specially ordered 10 lenses from the Zeiss company with an incredible aperture of 0.7, a unique case in history. I think they started making them in 1965, and by 1966 they were ready. They kept 1 lens in the Zeiss Museum, gave 3 to Kubrick, and 6 to NASA. And it turns out that each lens cost $1 million, and they didn't shoot anything with them. Because they were counting on rear projection, which was very popular in those years. For example, there's a film about Strauss, The Great Waltz, showing how he could...
Well, there's the rear projection, and there's this front projection using that new material from 3M that was ultra reflective. It's the same, made out of little glass beads. Same the stuff that I use in the paint on the highways to light up, all the signs and light in the paint to do the retro reflective. So that was the technology. I'm not sure if he knows about that technology or not, because it wasn't rear projection. It was something else. It was the front projection, but it was using that super reflective stuff, so it didn't have to have a sensitivity of the cameras. It wasn't as crucial because you have this super reflective screen. Go ahead.
Composes music. The actors ride in a carriage, the wheel creaks, and Strauss composes a waltz to this creak. In reality, they sit in a carriage in the studio, and a pre-filmed ride through the forest is shown on the screen behind them.
We had the same thing. Whenever one of the main characters was driving a car, there was a picture behind that was shot earlier.
Yes, a movie screen.
It was often used, indeed.
Of course, it was everywhere, but the screen was no more than 5 to 6 meters. Clearly, this would be a medium shot, but they needed to shoot the actor standing against the backdrop of the lunar mountain. Kubrick was given the task, and he struggled for a long time, and then finally found a way out. He used Scotch-Light as the
so he gets into it. All right.
material for the screen. The thing is, a white screen reflects light in different directions, but Scotch-Light reflects all the incoming light strictly in the direction from which it came. Based on this principle, the 3M company developed road signs. They are clearly visible from a distance when illuminated by headlights.
Okay.
The light from the headlights hits and reflects off the road signs like from a mirror. Scotch-Light material consists of the tiniest beads. There are 300 of the tiniest beads per inch. Kubrick was scolded. They told him, "Come on, how can this be? It's time to shoot. It's already 67. Tick-tock, time's a wasting." And he wasn't ready. The film was released in 1968, and he was late. Then, finally, he did it. And therefore, not waiting for this, NASA began shooting Apollo 11 in the studio without Kubrick's invention. That's why, in Apollo 11, there are no lunar mountains in the background. There, you can see that the lunar module is casting a shadow, and right behind the shadow, the moon ends. There hangs black velvet.
So, Kubrick started with the 12th or something?
No, he did other things, technology, something else. Most importantly, he was developing how to shoot 0G, and then we'll see what.
How to shoot 0G was invented by Pavel Plushantsev on a cable and shoot from the side where the cable is not visible.
Yes, Americans were behind us in real spacewalks. You know, for how many years? For 18. Alexei Leonov performed spacewalk in March 1965. The Americans say, "We'll do it too right now." And 2.5 months later, Ed White simply opened the hatch and went out into space. I look and see, guys, well, this is a composite shot. An actor is hanging on a rope, and behind him, they rotate a movie screen. And since the camera rotates synchronously with the movie screen, it turns out that the actor appears to be upside down. Such tricks are shown with the flight attendant in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey.
I remember how she is walking around there and it's spinning. By the way, that's also known. It's a rotating set. I think Chaplin also depicted something like that.
That was Fred Astaire's dance. Fred Astaire, the famous dancer. Royal Wedding. He dances in a circle, on the ceiling, on the walls. It was in 1951, Royal Wedding.
So now you're saying that the first American spacewalk was also a simulation?
Yes, they made the very first real spacewalk only on their shuttle in 1983. The first shuttle went up in 81, April 12, just to spoil. When Americans are asked, when is Cosmonautics Day? April 12, 81, because the shuttle went into space. Makes sense?
Yes, April 12th is not Gagarin. By the way, I looked. The Time magazine always chooses the person of the year. Gagarin should have been in 1961. No, they chose Kennedy as the person of the year because they have priority. If a new American president is elected, he automatically becomes person of the year. So, it's like an indicator of the level of all these assessments made by Americans.
Or no sooner had Barack Obama become president than he was immediately awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So, what's the matter? The movie 2001, A Space Odyssey is essentially a cover-up operation. I run a Zen channel called Cinematographer Stories, and I wrote an article where I say Kubrick's most tough shot, which he shot for a whole year. You know what this is? There's just an ordinary mountain, and there are several stones at the foot. He shot this scene for a whole year. Why? Because the mountain in the background is a shot from a large slide, a large transparency somewhere in Namibia. In the foreground is a set built in a studio. So, for the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, they went to Africa to shoot mountain landscapes. They first tried to find something in England, but it didn't work out, so they went to Namibia. The task was set. Since, according to the strategy, Americans should land on the moon when the sun is just rising, its rays are oblique. So, if you watch 2001, A Space Odyssey, they have a very low sun, and long shadows. So, the task was to shoot mountain landscapes with long shadows. They projected it onto a 30-meter movie screen. In the foreground, they poured the wrong color gray sand, but in reality, lunar sand, regolith, is dark brown, like chocolate.
Yes, theirs is all gray, but now they're shooting and it's brown.
But in those days, they didn't know. They made the wrong color grading of their surveyor images and concluded that the soil was gray. They missed.
So, the fact that their soil is gray is also evidence that it's all wrong.
Yes, and even more evidence is that now all the photos on the internet are being recolored.
They recolor theirs?
Yes, recolor everything. Or they say, you know, one can't trust NASA's official website. The scan is bad there, but download from Go to the Moon instead. There are new scans of better quality, and everything is already brown. As soon as we notice composite shots, everything is recolored. In my book, I present 18 photos where the lunar module seems to be flying in space. You can even find that photo with the masks. So, when we brighten up the picture, you can see the composite shots. While I was writing the book, while it was being published, literally a month ago, on NASA's official website, where I downloaded the photos from, they had been already corrected, the masks had been painted over, and you can't see the masks anymore.
I opened it and immediately found a positive photo of a cosmonaut with a red flag on the moon.
Yes, here I'm showing front projection.
We could have easily outdone them, at least shot similar film about going to the moon, and then the US moon program would have been completely over.
Yes, but they started preparing for this a long time ago. Who would actually fly on Apollo 11 became known only 3 months in advance. And the filming was going on in 1966-67 because there were still 6 or even 7 other missions ahead. And that's why they didn't know who would actually go. That's why you won't see a single face in any lunar video or photos.
And before that, a few
That makes sense, right? They didn't know who was going to be up there, so can't put film of who we don't know is going to be in. I can see it.
crews crashed on planes, those who were supposed to go. It makes a very strange impression.
These are all Hollywood stories. In reality, in lunar surface photos, you won't see a single face. There's only one photo where someone is looking from the
Yeah,
side.
that is odd, isn't it? I always ask that question, how come we can't see their faces when they want to be like, even just for a poke for just a quick minute, they brought golf clubs, they brought a Jeep, brought a dune buggy, all kinds of equipment, but they did never pop these are test pilots. They want to be known to be the guy. How do you prove it? Well, you gotta show your face, and they don't show it once. Really?
No, because nobody knew who would really go, and they didn't take astronauts, but actor doubles. I don't know who advised them. They took actors who were very short, about 40 centimeters shorter than Armstrong and Aldrin. Aldrin was tall. Let's look at the photo of our first trio from Apollo 11, where they stand against the lunar module. Here they stand in the landing pad. We see the landing legs, and see where his head is. It's projected onto the ladder. And on top, there should be a helmet like a spherical aquarium. It's loose so the head can turn. The astronaut is very tall in general. Look at the lunar photos, where the astronaut descends the ladder.
Yeah, I went to the museum there in Washington, D.C., and they have an exhibit showing the Apollo 11. It's like, yeah, I don't know how you get these packs out through that little door, but okay.
I aligned the ladder steps from a photo of Earth training with the ladder steps from the lunar footage. When I aligned them at the top of the helmet, it turned out that for the actor portraying the astronaut on the moon, the heel is at knee level. So, the role of Armstrong on the moon was played by an actor who was about 50 centimeters shorter than the famous Hollywood actor Neil Armstrong.
They found a Bushman or something. I mean, in terms of height, Armstrong is 180, and here it's about 130.
Yes, maybe around 135. Compared to any real person, the actors playing astronauts were approximately like this.
Why?
I don't know. For example, I show a photo where a NASA employee stands. Here, the flag was attached to the side. This is a flag case, which would later be planted. His head is at the top of the flag case. Here's the case. And here the lunar astronaut stands in the pad. He's up to his chest. That's how tall he was. I don't know why. Ask the question. Write an official request to NASA. Why they filmed dwarves.
Actually,
Yeah, I've not heard this one too, and they do look short. I have to go look at, cross-reference that one, but this is a new one to me as well. They use shorter people. I know they use some sort of actors or something, and that wasn't on the moon, but yeah, it's awful strange.
if it were a real mission, sending little people would be justified because they weigh less.
Yes, and they can fit into any hatch. Because we calculated it. A real 2-meter astronaut wouldn't fit into the hatch on the lunar module. They would get it.
Yeah, I figure that's what I figured. Like when you look at it, I'm like, oh, it don't make no sense. As a little person could, yeah, but not a full size, like not regular sized person, like a man.
in, and behind them, there's the life support backpack, which sticks out about 10 to 15 centimeters.
Yeah.
The astronaut needs to get in, push their head against the wall, then they have to rise vertically and stand in a cobra position, while the backpack is still outside and can't go through. So, if the astronauts were dwarfs, they really could have done all of this. What's most interesting?
Yeah.
I literally did it the day before yesterday. If you type into Yandex the phrase, Armstrong's height on the moon, what does our Yandex show?
Yes, exactly those 140 centimeters.
And it describes that the calculation was made based on the steps, meaning the distance between the steps is known. And it turns out to be 1 meter 40. But Armstrong's real height should be 180, and with the helmet, it should be 195. Such dwarfs.
They could have sent a crew of dwarfs, 140 centimeters tall, to the moon, but showed the beautiful ones, because an American at 140 centimeters, even if he was on the moon, is clearly inferior in appearance to the handsome Soviet cosmonauts. They had to present it that way.
I would like to talk about one more aspect of the issue. I'll show you what the launch site looks like. It's from the ocean side. In the distance is the vehicle assembly building. Here's the launch pad from where the rocket takes off. And you see that it's surrounded by swamps, lakes, I don't know how to call them correctly, water surface. What's the point? I'll show you from another side. Spectators could only be on this part. And the rocket launch was here. From the ocean side, where Apollo 11 was flying, there was no one. It was a restricted area.
And Tycoon's yachts?
There could have been a place of the first stage splashdown. Therefore, perhaps for safety reasons, everything was closed off. Interestingly, as you know, the rocket always launches in which direction?
To make use of Earth's rotation.
To the east, so that the Earth's rotation helps. Here is Cape Canaveral, and here is the real trajectory where according to the NASA's calculations the rocket should fly. Therefore, the spectators who stand right here always face east during the rocket launch. I want to show you a few photos. During the launch of Apollo 11, the weather was cloudy. This is a blend of two images. Apollo 11 is taking off. See? In which direction are the shadows cast? All the spectators seem to be bidding farewell. Like when we raise our hands in farewell, waving to our relatives. You know why? Actually, they're not waving goodbye with handkerchiefs. But do you know what they're doing?
No.
Look, I'll show you more photos. The thing is, the rocket launch was at 9:30 in the morning. At that moment, the sun had risen to about 37 degrees high. The rocket is launched in this direction. So, it's at a small angular distance from the sun. To see the rocket, everyone does this.
So, the sun blinds the eyes.
Yes, I'm showing a few pictures.
This one really looks like he's shielding himself from the sun.
Yes, see?
Lyndon Johnson?
Yes, the only one standing without sunglasses. You see the others, this man here?
Why is he without?
People ask, how could that be? Why didn't anyone see? Because of the clouds, everything was hazy. They were watching when the rocket lifted off, but there should have been an angle of just 10 degrees from the sun. So, the sun blinded them. The most interesting thing is that, according to legend, when the first stage separated and the second stage was already flying, we don't see the jet streams of burning gases. The first stage has separated. This is a clip from the 1970 film. It's called, I say it poorly in English, Moonwalk 1, probably, right? And here we see
Michael Jackson, Moonwalk.
Well, Michael Jackson wasn't there. What's the essence of it? When the first stage separates, the second one flies, and there are no burning gases behind it.
Yes, the second stage should ignite.
Americans say it's a new fuel, invisible and burns with invisible light. But the rocket must accelerate. I just don't know if we have time to show this clip now. If we look at this clip, the first stage flies, separates, and the second one flies parallel. That is, they fly parallel. The burning has already stopped in the first stage, and it should lag far behind. Moreover, to separate them, special engines are activated, and there's a brief explosion. They fly parallel for a long time. This indicates that the second stage is flying purely by inertia. In the 1970 film, there's a long shot. There's another very important point. Americans decided to simulate the rocket's flight. When a rocket is launched, initially it has a long and straight flame, but when the rocket ascends into the stratosphere, atmospheric pressure decreases, and the flame is not narrow anymore, it expands, like this. It's called a bell-shaped flame, and since, in reality, the rocket didn't ascend higher than 17 kilometers, they artificially created this bell-shaped flame. How did they do it? They started feeding oxygen through drainage. This is the first stage, and the flame rises high, about 20 meters. That's the height of a 7-story building. Some say that helium or oxygen mixed with something comes out of drainage. So, besides the main flame, they additionally created a phony volume, as if the rocket had ascended and this giant bell-shaped flame was flying.
But can't it explode? It means the fire goes along the hull.
Right along the hull.
But can the hull explode?
20 meters. Then there are explosions. Suddenly there are 2 short explosions. Some think the rocket might have exploded. Maybe, because in this mission, it's unclear which rocket is flying. Their main goal was to capture at least one somewhat real shot, and then everything else isn't so important. They will show the same shot applied to other rockets. Here's the main flame, and here's some white smoke, visually white and wide, as if accompanying the rocket. But I think it was all simulation. Here are the explosions, and only after that does the first stage start to separate. It flies for a long time. The second stage should fly with acceleration. The rocket became lighter. It should move and fly away with acceleration. This is in real time, without slowing down. The rocket flies for a long, long time, barely moving. Then the interstage ring connecting the 2 stages should detach from the second stage. From the very top, the launch escape system, which is no longer needed, will also be jettisoned, flying for a long time. Therefore, after reviewing the footage, taking a closer look, you can say, guys, what kind of mission is this? The interstage ring should lag behind, but it's flying alongside for a long time. This part, jettisoned from the top, also flies parallel. Why is the second stage not accelerating? No acceleration. So, there's no need to delve into details. What kind of engine was there? Was it aerosine, kerosene, or liquid oxygen? What pressure? What specific impulse? Just watch the video, watch rocket launches. They show a completely different rocket. Look at the first stage separation. I did calculations based on videos, of which I've watched a great number, including amateur videos. It turns out, the rocket flew along that parabola, reaching a height of about 15 to 17 kilometers, disappearing into the haze, descending, and the separation of the first stage was actually at a height of 7 to 8 kilometers.
That's very low. Even V2 flew much higher.
The rocket was heavy after all. It didn't have powerful engines. It was 110 meters tall. As I showed, the separation of the first stage should be at an altitude of 66 kilometers and at a distance of 95 kilometers from the launch site. Why am I sure that the separation of the first stage is not at an altitude of 66 kilometers? Because I reviewed other moments before separation and what happens there. Imagine a train going far into the distance. It can't quickly pass by a forest in the distance. It will move like a faraway dot. Or a plane flying far away, it's like a dot in the distance. And I'm watching the moment of the first stage separation, only captured from a different angle, and suddenly clouds are passing by the rocket, and in 2 seconds, small clouds pass by. So, the rocket is at an altitude close to the clouds. That's what it means. And the second very important moment. There's also a video by Alexander de Seversky. It's unclear if he's just a cinephile or works for NASA, because NASA uses all his videos in their official chronicle. He filmed the rocket launch, but for some reason, a lot is cut from the middle. One time 10 seconds are cut, sometimes a few more. But this is not the most important thing. Here, there's also a moment of passing through clouds. On the left, you can see the diaphragm from the sun, meaning the sun shines almost directly into the lens. And the most interesting thing is, now there will be a passage through the clouds we're familiar with. A shadow is cast,
Lens flare.
and then the rocket starts descending in a parabola. Here, for some reason, they cut out 10 seconds. The contrail starts forming. It's already large, and the rocket flies downward. Then, the simulation of the bell-shaped flame begins. Behind, the white trail becomes very large, and again, in the same place, the diaphragm from the sun enters the frame. That is, the rocket descends to the same spot. I'll stop here, and you see, if this were at high altitude, the trail would be more or less straight, but it's curved. This indicates that there's a very strong air current here. This is the moment of separation of the first stage. If the altitude were about 60 kilometers, there wouldn't be such air currents there. Where could they come from? If it were before 30 kilometers, there would be silver clouds. But here's the separation of the first stage. The wind blows away this entire trail. I watched amateur videos of other Apollo launches. Judging by the distance at which the cinephile is positioned, he wouldn't have been able to photograph the separation of the first stage. If it's over 100 kilometers away, and he has some cheap 8mm amateur camera, from a distance of just 15 kilometers from the launch pad, diagonally 110 kilometers away from the rocket. From a distance of 140 kilometers, he films the second stage, which is no more than 30 meters in size. How could a cinephile with a simple, cheap 8mm camera, without a super telephoto lens, from a distance of 140 to 150 kilometers, capture the flying second stage? And it's clearly visible. My conclusion is simple. The rocket didn't go anywhere. It was a staged event. Only the spectacular launch was shown. Renowned actors Armstrong, Aldrin, or Collins were not allowed into the studio. Instead, low-height actors were portrayed as astronauts. One girl wrote to me, "I sew according to the Berta magazine. And I know that if a person is tall, they usually have long legs. And judging by the astronauts running on the moon, I see that they have a symmetrical distance from the top to the navel and from the navel to the ankles. That is, these actors are about 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 3 inches tall." Even a girl who sews says, "It can't be." I sew, and I know that a tall person should have long legs. If we look at the astronauts in the photos of training on Earth, they have very long legs. We only talked about the launch, but if we start delving into various details, we'll see that the Americans lag behind us by many, many years. For example, re-entry into the atmosphere. From the moon, the rocket returns at the escape velocity, 11 kilometers per second. We understood that if the rocket enters the atmosphere head-on at such a speed, it will burn up, despite ablative protection. So, we came up with the skip re-entry. That is, the rocket enters the atmosphere at an angle, slows down, and exits the atmosphere. And during the second re-entry, when the speed has been reduced from 11 to 7.5 kilometers per second, it enters the atmosphere at the Earth orbital velocity, with which we had already practiced entering the atmosphere. We perfected this technology in 1968-69. These were Zond 6 and Zond 7. This was when we sent tortoises on a flight around the moon. Therefore, the first living beings to orbit the moon in the late 1960s were tortoises. There were also mealworms.
I didn't know that. The reptiles were the first to the moon? First Earth creatures to the moon? Okay, sounds good.
Various flies, but most importantly, there were tortoises. The Americans tested the skip re-entry on their spacecraft Orion as part of the Artemis program in 2021. So, they lagged behind us by 52 years, I think.
If it's 1968, then 53.
Yes, something like that. In developing a staged combustion engine, they also lagged behind us by about 53 years. They lagged behind by 18 years in terms of spacewalks.
There's lagging behind everywhere. At the same time, the impression is that they are surpassing us.
That's propaganda. Our propaganda is very weak. It's not about engaging in political propaganda. We don't have propaganda for our achievements. Moreover, just a
Wow. No, oh, come on. Okay.
few years ago, when you went to a children's toy store, there were only American astronauts, American lunar modules, assembled from 20 parts, and there were no Soviet ones. I still remember.
Well, that's the toy manufacturer's problem, not propaganda problem. I mean, Americans do pay for that stuff, but I mean, you have to support the toy manufacturer, man, if you want kids to be involved in these things. Sorry.
That during the times of the Soviet Union, we had Christmas tree decorations featuring our cosmonauts, planets, Saturn, and so on.
By the way, I've seen Soviet toys. Even now, I've seen them.
They're resuming. It's time for us too. We don't have propaganda for our achievements. Previously, there was the Bureau of Propaganda for Soviet Cinema. We know that everything is not so smooth in our space industry. From a propaganda point of view, even when we see that we have some successes, we hesitate to talk about them. For example, the Americans couldn't land their Peregrine on the moon. Or their Starship exploded. One exploded, the other exploded. But they say, you see, this is a success. We managed to lift off the launch pad. During the second launch, look.
Yeah, I mean, shouldn't you have that stuff perfected by now? No? Okay.
We soared up to 30 kilometers. To 30, but how did you fly on a rocket more than 50 years ago? And now you can't. They say,
yeah, just we need to have somebody like admit that, okay, we didn't do that. Sorry. We had to fool you. But they can never admit that. Right? They could never admit that stuff. And that's what's holding us back. And that's my whole thing about beefing on these guys is like, hey, I know you guys had to win the war and stay in power and stuff, but we kind of need to go to another planet at some point. And you guys are holding us back because you tried to win a war with theatrics and occult activities. But it's time to stop.
well, you see, now it's done by private companies. They all emphasize that.
Yes, they are saving money, so they order the cheapest. They order from whoever offers the cheapest. That's why the equipment breaks down. They should order from the Chinese.
Yes, private companies. We say to this, wait, but launching from the Space Launcher Complex, this is not a private company. And tracking satellites, ships, radio telescopes, what's there from a private company? There's nothing. It's all done with state money. It's all military budgets, and everything is...
It's all military budgets. Let's be real honest about that. Elon is getting all that stuff. That's all tax money. Let's be real honest. Tesla, tax money. Come on.
Consolidated in NASA.
As for propaganda, that's a valid point. I always say that we should advertise our scientific achievements in any way possible within the country and as best we can worldwide, so that everyone knows that we are a leading scientific power. Otherwise, people are absolutely not interested in it. In the 1960s, everyone was interested in the fact that we were the first in space. It was a celebration, and now you can still find achievements. We were the first somewhere else.
I listed the recent missions to the moon. The Israeli Bereshit, which crashed onto the moon, and the Japanese, and the United Arab Emirates, and the American. They all crash onto the moon.
Well, that may not be because of their technological. There may be something else going on the moon that makes it not possible for people to land stuff on the moon. Maybe it's not a moon. Maybe it's not our moon.
But let's remember that the first soft landing was accomplished in 1966. It was our Luna 9. And we understood that there would be a strong impact, so there was a shock-absorbing sphere, a ball. Then it opened, and inside was our Luna 9.
We also landed the Lunohode there.
Yes, not just one, but two.
Yes, which was remotely controlled. I spoke with the Lunohode pilot, and he told me about how once he met with workers from a factory. He was introduced as the Lunohode pilot. They started applauding, and I realized they thought I was there too. It was very interesting. Well, we're wrapping up for now, but we still have other missions.
Of course.
There were many Apollos, 6 manned ones. So, I think we'll meet again, and then we'll talk about the inconsistencies in other missions from your perspective.
I really want to talk about Apollo 15 and 16 the most, because they are such cartoons, such special effects. Art is just bursting out of all the shots.
Thank you very much. So, dear viewers, we will discuss Apollo 15 and 16 in our third program. It will be a triptych, so stay tuned. Watch our first podcast. Goodbye.
All right. We'll go check it out. And thanks for watching along. And if that comes out and looks interesting, I'll definitely share it. Okay. Thanks for watching. Give me a like, subscribe. Talk to you soon. Bye.